Okay, Boisai, welcome back. Today we are moving on to the actual mitzvah of matzah. We had a lot of preface. We did a lot of breaking bread. We had 2 episodes on breaking bread and doing it right, and how you lift the bread and how you break it and you don't break it. We're going to touch on a little breaking today, a little bread breaking, but the main thing is going to be what we eat. And you're in for a surprise. And people who find out what they're actually supposed to do might not want to have a Seder plate. They might want to have somebody else have the Seder plate. Because you're going to find out that somebody's got to eat a double portion of matzah, not of roast beef. Anyway, tonight's class is called What We Eat. I know matzah, but what we eat. And it is dedicated by Ron and Lena Berman in honor of Ron's mother's yahrzeit, which I believe is in 2 days. Lena's mother's. Did I say it wrong? Sorry, Lena's mother's yahrzeit. And her name was Sheina Bas Nachman. So the neshama should have an aliyah. And as we say, Fa'ale Yidden a groise yeshia. And I'm sure that the neshama has nachas from the Torah that we studied together. I have no question about that. I'm not going to get there. I'll quote it without getting inside. All right, just getting everything opened up here. Open all the big books, as we say. To be sure, the class that we are going to focus on tonight does stand on its own. I think I said this last week also. It does stand on its own. But it's very helpful if you watched the last episode and the episode before that, especially because some of the jurisprudence or the legal philosophy that will govern many of the details that we're going to learn about tonight have been addressed at length in the previous episode. I'm going to touch on it very briefly, just as a quick reminder, but it's not fair to those of you who are here, and as well as the people online who have been watching and learning to repeat everything. So I'm not going to repeat everything. But if there's something that's not clear, I mean, you could ask. If there's something that's not clear, I encourage you to ask, and you could ask online if the questions are on the subject. And if it's not clear, it's very possible that if you watch the previous episode or the episode before that one, that things will become clear. Okay. So, it's a very, very brief recap. We had this discussion about making the bracha over the matzah. And that the initial bracha, and this goes back 2 episodes, Breaking Bread 1, is recited over 3 matzot, a whole matzah on the top, a broken matzah on the middle, and then a 3rd matzah on the bottom. And we're holding them together. And why are we doing that? Because we have the mitzvah called Lechem Mishnah. On Shabbat and on Yom Tov, we have Lechem Mishnah. We have 2 whole loaves, which on Pesach or Passover means 2 whole wafers. The bread of the challah is now matzah. But it's the same idea. It's not inherently different. I mean, it's very different, but it's the same concept. And we had a big discussion about this, whether you need to have 2 whole loaves or maybe a half suffices. And there's a strong opinion that says a half suffices. And ultimately, that's not even the reason why we have 3 matzahs. Although the Vilna Gaon used to take 2 matzahs following the sheet of the Rif, the truth is that the reason we take 3 matzahs is very clear, because it adds up to the flour that was used for the Korban Todah, and it also recalls the way Avraham Avinu prepared for his guests, which was on Pesach, and he was making matzah, and it says it was shloish se'in, or 3 measures. Okay, so there's 3 matzahs. We're making the bracha over the 3 matzahs, holding all 3 matzahs, the top and the bottom and the middle, so we fulfill the mitzvah of Lechem Mishnah. Now, that's for the bracha of Hamotzi Lechem Min Haaretz. Then, we said we let go of the bottom matzah, and we're going to be holding the top 2 matzahs. And as we learned about in last week, like our fingers are actually on the matzah. We're actually holding the matzah in our right hand, and we're supporting it with our left hand. We're actually holding it, unless you're a lefty, it's the other way around. And we're making a bracha of al achilat matzah. So now we're up to not the Lechem Mishnah, which is a mitzvah, but it's a mitzvah it's not unique to Pesach. Now up to the unique Passover, a Pesach mitzvah. The night of the Seder, where we're eating matzah, and incidentally, in today's day and age, this is the only edible mitzvah we have. Like real edible mitzvah. At the time of the Beit HaMikdash, there were many edible mitzvot. Yes?
Matzah is in a, whether it's a cloth or metal container, do you hold that? Like is in Shabbos,
that's a really good question. It's a really good question, Dr. Krishna. And the answer to that question is, your hands don't have to physically be touching the matzah. And the proof is that between the matzahs there is cloth, and the Rebbe did not take them out of the cloth. Even though the Rebbe used 3 separate cloth napkins, he held them, and it's pretty clear. It says pretty clear in a number of sources that when it comes to Lechem Mishnah, the important thing is to be holding the bread together. Incidentally, it's an interesting question that people ask, do you have to take it out of the plastic bag? If you're having Lechem Mishnah, can you leave a challah in a plastic bag? And the answer is you actually can. You actually can. You don't have to actually touch the bread. If somebody is wearing gloves for whatever reason, it still would be holding the matzah. The point is you're holding it. And that's a subject for another day, but I could prove it to you from multiple sources. So we dropped the bottom matzah because now we're not worried about Lechem Mishnah, now we're worried about al-chilas matzah. Now this will sound strange if you weren't at the last episode, but there is a question, a very serious question in halacha amongst serious people, 2 very, very profound schools of thought. Which is the bracha of al-achilat matzah? Which is the blessing over the matzah? Is it the jagged matzah, the broken piece, or is it over the whole matzah? So a mitzvah, some would argue, should be done over a whole matzah. It's a mitzvah. What about the broken piece? Well, the broken piece is because that's the way Passover should look. It should be lechem oni. But a mitzvah should be done over a whole. So the bracha of al-achilat matzah is on the top matzah. Then there's another school of thought, which is really, it's not the other, that's the primary school of thought, the ikar, which is that the hamotzi lechem menorah was made over the top matzah. However, the middle matzah, that's the real lechem oni. That's the real poor person's bread. That's the bracha of al-achilat matzah. And what you need to understand here is that this is not entirely clear. It's not entirely clear which matzah we're actually making the bracha over. Which is going to cause us, I'm not going to say a heartache, but it's going to cause us challenges. And because of this, we're going to be chomping at a lot more matzah than you originally might have planned for. But before we go to that, we're going to talk about the blessing that is recited. The blessing that's recited is Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam, asher kedishanu, we bless God, who has sanctified us with his mitzvot, with his commandments, vitzivanu, and he commanded us. Don't look inside. What did he command us to do? To eat matzah. How do you say to eat in Hebrew? Lechol, right? So what should the bracha say? It should say lechol matzah, to eat matzah. When you sit down or spend time in a sukkah, you make a bracha. What does the bracha sound like? Asher kedishanu b'mitzvotav vitzivanu leishev basukkah. What does leishev mean? To sit. It's not actually sitting. It means like teishvu kein taduru. Means to spend time. Settle down, as they say. Make yourself at home. So the action is the mitzvah. The action is the mitzvah. Because the action is the mitzvah, the bracha is leishev. Leishev. And the question that comes to mind here is, so why do we recite Asher kedishanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu al achilat matzah, on the eating of matzah? Instead of saying on the eating of matzah, we should say le'echol matzah. Now, this may come as a surprise to you, but in many communities, that actually is what they say. They make a bracha and they say Asher kedishanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu le'echol matzah. And it actually makes perfect sense. So the question becomes, why do we say al achilat matzah? And the reason that I shared with you, the conundrum of the top matzah or the middle matzah, meaning the broken nature of the lechem oni, is that what informs the mitzvah? Or is that normal bread? On Pesach, normal bread is lechem oni. So normal bread is a broken piece of bread, which, by the way, is why the Rif says you don't need 2 whole matzot on Pesach. A broken matzah serves just fine, because that's what matzah is. This is not mutually exclusive to this conversation that we're going to have now. This idea has something to do with everything we just talked about. And the mitzvah, the bracha, is ala chilat matzah. So this is the Alter Rebbe. The Alter Rebbe that's the language Alter Rebbe uses. He says, you have in mind, you make this bracha, and you have in mind the other things we talked about, the kricha, the korach. We talked about that in our previous episode. We talked about the afikoman. And he says, yifter, all of that will be exempted, bibracha zo, with this bracha. And the bracha reads, al achilat matzah. By the way, the same question, of course, was also going to come when it comes to moror, because we don't say le'echol moror, we also make the bracha of al achilat moror. Oh, so this begs the question, what's going on here? Why are we making this bracha? Why are we using the syntax of a bracha, which does not refer to the commandment itself? The commandment is eat the matzah. So make a bracha, le'echol matzah. So in the Rebbe's Haggadah, and that the copies I made for you, it's actually you can see it in the Hebrew on the top. Here you are, Marshall. You can see it in the Hebrew. It's the translation on the bottom is a simplification of the ideas that are talked about. So I made these photocopies for you to have them. It's made for children, but just a simplification of the idea. But we're going to learn the Hebrew and focus. I'm going to share with you the background and the profundity and the depth, so you'll be able to appreciate and understand this. The Rebbe says, "V'lo le'echol matzah, al achilat v'lo le'echol." So first of all, the Rebbe brings a number of sources. There's something called the Sefer HaPardis that was authored by Rashi. And in Rashi's handwriting, it says that the right bracha to make is al achilat matzah. All right, that's pretty impressive. I mean, if Rashi wrote that, that's. Now, I don't have the Sefer HaPardis, but I do have the Machzor Vitri. And Rabbi Simcha Vitri was a prime disciple of Rashi. And we believe that the teachings of Rabbi Vitri are, by and large, the teachings of Rashi. So in the Machzor Vitri, on what he calls the Seder Pesach Aruch Merashi, the expanded Seder of Rashi. So he was the disciple of Rashi. He watched everything Rashi did. He learned everything from Rashi. So he says, Mevarach HaMotzi ala matzah hashlema ha'elyona, the bracha of HaMotzi is over the top matzah. But surprisingly, he says ubotzeya, then you break the matzah. And he says, but even though you broke the matzah, which by the way, we're not going to do that. I'm pointing that out, you are not going to do that, and we'll soon see why. But don't eat anything. Until you're going to take some of the middle matzah also. And Rabbi Simcha writes in his Seder Ha'aruch Merashi, umevarech, and you make the bracha, Asher kedishanu b'mitzvot tzivanu, he who has sanctified us with his commandments, and he instructed us or commanded us, al achilat matzah. The Machzor Vitri adds 4 very interesting words, which incidentally we do not do. We do not follow this, and I will tell you why we don't follow this. But he then adds the next 4 words, umechalek lekulam mishtehen yachad. You give a little piece of the matzah, the top matzah and the middle matzah. You give a little piece of the top and the middle matzah to everybody. Now this is meaningful. This is an important thing. I want you to put this in the back burner for a moment. So you made the bracha, and you give a little piece of the top matzah, which is the hamotzi, the middle matzah, which is the al achilat matzah. You distribute that to everybody. So that's clearly the opinion of Rashi. Rabbeinu Yitzchak Gios is one of the very early Rishonim who wrote codification, cites in the name of Rav Amram Gaon, who was one of the greatest of the Gaonim. That was the Torah leaders in the period after the close of the Talmud, the period that flourished afterwards. All of the Torah literature and the response that developed during that period was called Tshuvat HaGaonim, the response of the Gaonim. So Rav Amram Gaon is one of the most significant Gaonim. He also says that. Now, the problem here is that we have a Siddur, which is called Siddur or Seder Rav Amram Gaon. And in Rav Amram Gaon's Siddur, it says, Asher kedishanu b'mitzvotav etzivanu le'echol matzah. So there's a little bit of a problem. But Yitzchak Gios, Gios, cites this teaching in the name of Rav Amram Gaon, which is very, very interesting. It's very interesting that he cites a teaching in the name of Amram Goren, because Rav Amram Goren himself seems to say otherwise, and there's either one of two things could be the case. Sorry, let me just shut this down so it doesn't disturb us. One of two things could be the case. Either, one possibility is that Rav Amram Goren later on changed his Halakhic opinion, which of course is very possible. And the other possibility is that there was some kind of printing mistake. It's not a given, it's not impossible to suggest that there was some error could have crept in, and if Rabbi Yitzchak Gio says that that's what he received from Rav Amram Goren, it's reasonable to assume that's the case. At any rate, that's what he says in the name of Rav Amram Goren. So we have Rashi, we have the Yitzchak Gios in the name of Rav Amram Goren, and we also have the Rambam. We have the Rambam. Because the Rambam writes in the laws of Chometz Matzah, and this is going to be in chapter 8, where the Rambam speaks about the bracha that's recited. He says you make a bracha of hamotzi, and then he says, do you take the matzah and the maror, because the Rambam's opinion is that we eat the matzah and the maror together, and he says, Asher kedishanu b'mitzvot tzavet tzivanu al achilat matzah u'merorim. He doesn't say lechol matzah u'merorim, he says al achilat matzah u'merorim. So we're not talking about the distinction between the Rambam and between the other Rishonim who believe that you have to eat matzah in and of itself. The point being made here is that the blessing, the syntax of the blessing, al achilat matzah, shows up in the Rashi, Rigios in the name of Amram Goren, and Rambam. Now the question, of course, is why? First of all, we've established we have good credentials. we have what to rely on. But why? What's the logic behind this? So the Rebbe says, the reason is mipnei shemoitzi gam acherim hashomim, because you are doing something when you make this bracha on behalf of others as well. So if I make a bracha le'echol matzah, who is that bracha meaningful for? If I make a bracha le'echol matzah, for me, I can't eat for you. Nobody can eat for somebody else. Nobody can fast for somebody else. Those are some of the things that's called a mitzvah shebegufay. Mitzvah shebegufay you have to do by yourself.
For a little monkey wrench, hands on the tilat.
Oh, that's a good monkey wrench. Hold the monkey wrench. It's good. That's good. It's a good wrench. We're going to get to it in a minute. That's what the Rebbe says. That's what the Rebbe says. That why? Because le'echol is a bracha that only goes for me. Al achilat is for us. I'm making a bracha for us. So when I make a bracha of hamotzi lechem min haaretz, I'm holding two matzot. Everybody around the table doesn't have two matzot. Or by the way, on a regular Friday night or Shabbat morning, everybody around the table doesn't necessarily have two chalot either. But we'd have a lot of extra challah. Or very little challahs. If you want to have a nice big Friday night challah, right? If everybody around the table had two big challahs, then either we would be very, very heavy, very overweight, or it would be a problem, right? So what happens? What happens is whoever's leading the meal recites the bracha, hamotzi lechem min haaretz, and what does the bracha mean for everybody else? That's how you fulfill your mitzvah of lechem mishnah. Lechem mishnah. There's a mitzvah of lechem mishnah. The mitzvah of having two breads is fulfilled by virtue of the bracha that's recited by the person who recites the bracha, hamotzi lechem min haaretz. Let me ask you an interesting question now. If I was listening to the person who made the bracha and I answered amen, can I still make my own hamotzi lechem min haaretz? Because I know how to make a bracha. Can I still make my own bracha? The answer is yes, I can. However, my bracha of hamotzi lechem min haaretz only works for my own consumption. The leader's bracha of hamotzi lechem min haaretz was far more than consumption. It was also that which graced the meal with the mitzvah or idea of the double bread, which is a commemoration of the manna and Hashem's miracles, and God takes care of us, and there's a lot packed into the manna and its representation and its meaning. The point is that bracha works for everybody. Now, the bracha of al achilat matzah is being recited over the top and the middle, but the matzah, where has this matzah been for the last hour or two? Where has the matzah been? Yes, it's been between the cloths. Where else has it been? This is not a trick question. You don't know where the matzah has been. It's been to Japan, it's been to... Where's the matzah been?
On the table.
On the table, on the table. So let me remind you of the Gemara that we learned where we talked about matzah is lechem oni. The second opinion is oni means that it's impoverished, from the word ani. But the first opinion, the first idea is that the lechem is onin alav dvarim harbe. In English, a visual aid. It's the visual aid matzah. It's the matzah that is placed on the table before we are prepared to eat. Why? Because we want to say, this is the matzah. This is how we left Egypt. We're telling a story, not just verbally. We tell the story with song, and we tell the story with pizzazz, and we tell the story with visual aids. And the matzah is the thing we're saying all these parts of the Haggadah over. And incidentally, when there's certain parts of the Haggadah that we recite over a glass of wine, because when you sing Hashem's praises, you're supposed to raise a glass of wine, what do we do to the matzah then? If you remember, we cover the matzah. We're ignoring the matzah. We don't want to turn away from the matzah. So we cover the matzah, being respectful to the matzah, and then we focus on the wine. And we put the wine down, and then we open the matzah again. So this is the matzah. You're making a bracha ala chilas matzah, on the eating of matzah. It's not just any matzah. This is the matzah that's been on the table for the last hour or two. This is the matzah we just did the whole story with, the whole Haggadah with. And you're making the bracha. And you are fulfilling this mitzvah of eating this bracha. You're making the bracha on everybody's behalf. There's something there, something going on here. So you're helping them make the bracha. Now, incidentally, they don't technically have to make their own bracha, although our custom is you do make your own bracha. You make hamotzi lechem min haaretz, and you have in mind the things you're supposed to have in mind, and you make a alachilas matzah, and you have in mind the korech and the afikomen. Everybody does that, not just the leader of the Seder. Now, where does the Rebbe get this from? Since when does the fact that you make a bracha alachila, how is that sanctioned? Where is the origin of this? So there is a very interesting origin of it. The origin that Rebbe here cites can be found in the teachings of the Migdal Oz. First, he cites the Maggid Mishnah. The Maggid Mishnah is a very important commentary that was written on certain parts of the Mishnah Torah of the Rambam. And he cites, the Maggid Mishnah is found in Laws of Chametz U'Matzah. The Maggid Mishnah is the primary commentator on Maggid Mishnah on Chametz U'Matzah. And a commentary known as Migdal Oz, which is found in the book of Ahava, of love, and that is in the laws of blessings. I'll say from Adan Av we have Migdal Oz, and there in the Migdal Oz, there is the origin of this. So what does the Maggid Mishnah say? The Maggid Mishnah, in his commentary, in the 8th chapter of the laws of Chametz and Matzah, because the Rambam divides the laws of Pesach, the tractate of Pesach, he divides them into the book of Zmanim, of sanctioned or sanctified times, and that's where he puts the laws of Chametz and Matzah, and then the laws of Korban Pesach, the Rambam puts into a book which is called Korbanot, the book of offerings, because it's an offering. And the truth is that Rambam's idea is a very old idea, because originally the tractate Pesachim had Pesach Aleph and Pesach Bez. Bet. It was two separate tractates. One was a tractate that was about a Korban Pesach primarily. One was a tractate that was about Chametz. Getting rid of Chametz. But the Rambam had reorganized it, where he took out the business of Matzah and the Seder and put it into the Chametz U'Matzah, and then he left only the laws of Korban Pesach and put it into a different book altogether. By the way, that's why the tractate is called Pesachim, which is plural. Two Pesachs. Pesach Aleph and Pesach Beis. Okay. So the Rambam in the laws of Chametz and Matzah, which is in the book of Zmanim, of sanctified times, in the 8th chapter, the Rambam is going through the Seder. Rambam even includes a Haggadah in his halachas, where he tells you, here's what the Haggadah should sound like. So the Maggid Mishnah says, V'ra'iti nusach habrachot b'divrei Rabbeinu. I see that the syntax in the words of our master, meaning the Rambam, is al achilat matzah, al achilat maror. What is the reason for this? Ostensibly, the mitzvah is to eat. So, leishev basukah, the bracha should be le'echol matzah. Says the Maggid Mishnah, however, based on what we find in the 11th chapter of the laws of blessings, which is in the book of love, because the book of love talks about the various things we do to nurture and to curate our love for Hashem, including counting our blessings and reciting blessings over all kinds of things, whether we're going to be enjoying something or whether we're going to be thanking Hashem in a special way, or performing a mitzvah, which all these things require a blessing. That's how we count our blessings, by making these blessings, by reciting these blessings. So in the 11th chapter of Hilchos Brachos, I'm going to go there in a minute, the Maggid Mishnah says that we see the mipnei shebebracha zo motzi atzmo va'acherim imo hashomim oto. Because when you make this bracha, you're not only making it for yourself, you're making it for others as well. When the Baal Tokea, when the one who is going to sound the shofar on Rosh Hashanah, recites the blessing, what bracha do they make? Asher kadishanu b'mitzvot havetzivanu litkoa. No.
No. I forget.
No. Lishmoa kol shofar. Because the mitzvah is not to blow it. The mitzvah is to hear it. It happens to be somebody has to blow the shofar in order to be able to hear the shofar, right? But the mitzvah is to hear the shofar. And when the Baal Tokea is blowing or sounding the shofar, and everybody else is listening to the shofar, is the Baal Tokea fulfilling a mitzvah better than anybody else? No, of course not. Of course not. Why? Because everybody's mitzvah is to hear the shofar. Now, interestingly enough, when the Megillah is read, the bracha is al mikra, not al shmiya. Why? Because the person who is reading the Megillah is actually doing it on everybody else's behalf. He's doing it as a shliach. He's doing it as an agent. That's why a child can't blow. Can't read but it's al mikra on the reading because everybody else is going to be listening to that reading and fulfilling their reading by virtue of the reading of the reader. This is why the Rogatchover Gaon says, why when it comes to the 10 sons of Haman, do we have to all recite it? Whether we have a kosher Megillah in front of us or not, everybody has to recite the 10 sons of Haman in one breath because nobody can breathe for you. When you have to acknowledge a certain miracle that happened by virtue of the same breath, when they all gasped the same breath and they all killed at the same moment, these monsters all rubbed out at the same moment, so we want to commemorate that miracle nobody can do for you. Somebody can read for you, nobody can breathe for you. Since that's a breathing exercise, that's why you have to do it by yourself. So the Rambam says here, that motzi atzmo v'acherim imo hashomim oto she'ein tzrichim levarich. But Maggid Mishnah himself says tzarich iyan. It's a little bit hard to understand this because many others have said that the proper bracha is lechol matzah or lechol morer, and the Maggid Mishnah himself says, I personally favor that approach because you have to eat it by yourself. Nobody can eat the matzah for you. Nobody can eat morer for you. If you can't eat, then you don't have the mitzvah. So that's it's very interesting. It's very interesting. Like, how exactly does this work? Incidentally, what happens if you only have a tiny bit of matzah? Can you make a bracha? If you only have a little bit of matzah, a few crumbs of matzah. So the answer is a kazayit. Otherwise, you can't fulfill the mitzvah. Is it meaningful? I mean, people are doing the best they could. Sure, it's meaningful. There's a beautiful story that's told about the Pesach in Auschwitz with the Klausenberger Rebbe. And somehow they managed to bake a few crumbs of matzah. Somehow. Took flour away and managed to bake a few crumbs. It was a Seder in the barracks. Hundreds and hundreds of people packed into the barracks, all risking their lives. And the Klausenberger Rebbe was leading the Seder. And there was only a few crumbs of matzah. And the question was, who should eat the matzah? Who should eat the matzah? So people said the Rebbe should eat the matzah. The Rebbe should eat the matzah on our behalf. And I'm not sure exactly how the story works out because the men's camp and the women's camp were separate camps, but somehow the men and women were together. And there was a woman who was hiding her child. She had a little child somehow hiding in the camps. And again, I'm not 1,000% sure of the veracity of the story and its details, but I don't think it's a made-up story. The story's a story. And she said, I have a child here, the Jewish child. He's the only child here. He should eat the matzah. He should eat the matzah. Because Pesach is about the children. And the Klausenberger Rebbe said, she's right. And incredibly enough, after the war, that's the woman he married. He lost his wife and 11 children. He ended up marrying that woman. So this is like the kind of discussions, of real life stories of what happens when there isn't matzah. But halacha is halacha, and a bracha is a bracha. So nobody can make the bracha for you. Nobody's making a bracha for you. So therefore, it makes sense to say, lechol matzah. But the Rambam says no. Now, what is the Maggid Mishnah? The Maggid Mishnah is, he doesn't necessarily agree, but he's telling you, this is the Rambam's opinion. He's explaining to you the Rambam's approach, which is the approach of Rashi, as we learned, and Rebbe Yitzchak and many others. And that's what Alter Rebbe Paskins also. That's what we do. So this is based on the understanding of the Migdal Oz in the Rambam in the laws of Brachot. In the laws of Brachot, the Rambam speaks about in the 11th chapter, in the 15th halacha, the 15th paragraph, he says like this. He says, you take a lulav. What bracha do you make? He says, al natilat lulav. But why don't you make the bracha litol lulav? And he says it's very simple. Because once you picked up the lulav, you already did your mitzvah, kind of. You can't say the bracha litol when you're actually holding it already. Litol means to take it, but you took it already. Because you're holding the lulav. You're not holding the etrog. You didn't finish the mitzvah, but you already took the lulav. So therefore, he says you have to make a bracha al natilat. But he says, what if you would make a bracha when the lulav is on the table in front of you? Then you would make a bracha litol, because that's the mitzvah. In fact, that's not the way we do it. But then it would make sense to say litol, to take. Kimo, like leishev basukah. Mikana talomid, says the Rambam. From here you can derive whenever you make a bracha after you have started to perform the mitzvah, then you make a bracha on the mitzvah, al ha'asiyah, not to do it, because you can't make a bracha to do it. You already started to do it. What was your question before? Netilat yadayim. When do you make the bracha? Before you wash your hands or after you wash your hands? After. So how could you make a bracha litol yadayim? You already washed your hands. Incidentally, why do we make the bracha? That's the next thing the Rambam talks about. Aval netilat yadayim. The Rambam says because they are divrei harishut, because they are not mandatory things. But another answer, that's not the answer the Rambam gives, but another answer is because we wash our hands first. And the reason we wash our hands first is because sometimes you can't make a bracha yet until you wash your hands. Right? So it wouldn't work otherwise. And he says the same thing is true when you make the bracha on the bir chametz, on the destruction of chametz. He says, "Bein shabadik la'atzmei shabadik la'cherim," because mishosh gomer b'libi levatel, the moment in your heart you said, "I don't want to have any chametz." How do I know you don't want to have chametz? How can I be sure you don't want to have chametz? Because you just lit a candle and you took a feather in your hand and you're going to check your house. You're going to search for chametz. Why are you going to search for chametz? Because you want to have chametz on Pesach. People who want to have chametz in the house of Pesach, chas v'shalom, are not going to search for chametz. So if somebody is going to search for chametz, then already you know that he doesn't want to have chametz. So on some level, he already did the mitzvah. The moment you don't want the chametz to be yours, it isn't yours. You kind of renounce, but so he says, you did it already. If you did the mitzvah, you did it. The ridiculous story that the teacher calls the father and says, "Your son wanted to hit me." So the father said, "How do you know my son wanted to hit you?" The teacher said, "Because he did." So bein shabadik la'atzmei, bein shabadik la'cherim, you already started doing the mitzvah. Now the Migdal Oz kind of goes to town with this, and he says, "Okay, so then explain to me a whole bunch of other brachas." You forgive me, this print is getting very small over here. I can't see this with glasses. So the Migdal Oz says, so what about the bracha of Mikra Megillah? What about that bracha? Why do we make likrot? Why do we say al mikra? And he said, Migdal Oz is a very interesting thing. Because even though a person can read the Megillah by himself, ideally the reading of the Megillah should take place in a crowd. There should be a minimum of a minyan present, ideally. And because that's the case, so that's the ideal takana of the sages. And the reason is, parsumei nisa, because you want to publicize the miracle. So if you want to publicize the miracle, then you need a crowd. Without a crowd, so therefore it makes sense al mikra. And he says, what about the mitzvah of Chanukah? where we say, lahadlik ner Chanukah. So he says the mitzvah of Chanukah is a mitzvah that everybody does on their own. And therefore, because everybody can do the mitzvah on their own, and you don't need to have, so to speak, a crowd. It's not a public mitzvah per se. The original mitzvah of Hanukkah was a private mitzvah. The whole idea of public menorahs was a later injunction of the sages. So therefore, the bracha was made, lahadlik ner, or lahadlik ner shel Hanukkah. This is the Migdal Oz's approach. And the Migdal Oz says that based on this, we can have this general rule that whenever we are going to be including others in our bracha, then we are going to be making a bracha al ha'asiyah. So this is the Maggid Mishnah's logic in explaining the Rambam's ruling in the laws of Chametz U'Matzah. And this is what the Rebbe cites. The Rebbe cites this as this is the halachic logic behind the bracha of al achilat matzah. Now, I want to add a little nuance here, and I think this is accurate, although I'm not 1,000% sure. But I think this has a lot to do with which matzah we're making which bracha over. We talked about the top matzah. One school of thought is that's the hamotzi. The other school of thought is the top matzah is the alachilat matzah, the mitzvah of eating matzah. And then we talked about another school of thought is that the hamotzi is on the broken piece. But the alachilat matzah is on the whole matzah. So who's covering these bases? Who's making the bracha possibly over a whole matzah and possibly over a broken matzah, or possibly over a broken matzah, or possibly over a whole matzah? Who's covering all those bases? The person who's holding up the... So how will everybody else have all that? Like, that's part of the mitzvah. There's a Lechem Mishnah mitzvah. And we're not sure which one was the bracha of Lechem Mishnah. And we don't know which is the bracha of Alachilat Matzah. So the only way everybody can fulfill that is if they're part of the mitzvah. So it makes sense that the bracha should be Alachilat Matzah. That's part of the logic. Because we have the different schools of thought. That's what the bracha is, Alachilat Matzah. It makes perfect sense.
One of the most important ceremonial blessings is and when you're saying it through people, isn't there a word?
So that's a very good question you're asking, Bill. Your question is, but is not accurate because Ber Priagofen is not a blessing of a mitzvah. That's called Birchas Hanenin. That's a bracha over the pleasure that you're about to derive from ingesting the wine. And whether you're doing a bracha over a glass of wine for a mitzvah purpose, or you're doing it because you just want to have a glass of wine, you still need to make a bracha of Ber Priagofen. As such, the Birchas Hanenin are in a separate category of blessings. Right? There are three categories of blessings. There are Birchas Hanenin. There are blessings that we recite over things we enjoy, like food or pleasant aromas. There are brachas of mitzvahs, like we're talking about now. You're going to sound the shofar. You're going to read the Megillah. You're going to eat the matzah, take the lulav, spend time in the sukkah. It's a blessing over a mitzvah. And then there's something called Birchas HaShevach, blessings of thanksgiving. Like there's a special bracha that we make, a number of brachas like this, like Kiddush. It's a Birchas HaShevach. It's a thanksgiving to God. The bracha of Geula that we recite at the night of the Seder, and the bracha of Shechianu. So these are not over a particular mitzvah, but over the joy that I feel at this particular moment. The common denominator is that in all of the blessings I'm making, I am counting my blessings. I'm counting my blessings and I'm able to enjoy Hashem's great, beautiful world. And I'm able to eat and drink and take in beautiful smells. I'm counting my blessings that I have the privilege of being a member of Am Yisrael and I'm able to do mitzvahs. I'm counting my blessings that I'm acknowledging Hashem's largesse and Hashem's generosity and Hashem's benefaction, and I'm thanking Hashem and I'm showing appreciation. So in all of the blessings, I'm counting my blessings. But it's a different kind of blessing. So the syntax that we're discussing here is the bracha, is the Birchas HaMitzvahs. Okay, we're good? That's the first part of tonight's class. First part of tonight's class was, I called it the blessing of inclusion. Blessing of inclusion, it's not what it sounds like, but the idea of the blessing of inclusion is, It's a blessing that is including the entire assemblage. The people who are sitting around the table, you're making this bracha for them as well, al achilat matzah. Okay. The next point we're going to make now is the double breaking. There's a double breaking that takes place. So we're going back to breaking bread. And here we see that although we read earlier in the Simcha Vitri says you break the top matzah and then make the bracha of al achilas matzah, but that wouldn't work for the other school of thought. And we're trying to cover both schools of thought. And because we're trying to cover the school of thought, which is the school of thought of Rashi, is that the hamotzi is on the top matzah and al achilas matzah is on the middle matzah. We talked about that. Rashbam follows that approach. Rabbi Yitzchak and the Tosfos follows that. But then most of the Bali HaTosfot and the Shita of the Geonim and the Ravia and others clearly say, in the Ravon, they hold that the bracha of Mitzvah is on the top matzah and the bracha of Hamotzi is on the middle matzah. Okay, so now, if we would make a bracha of Hamotzi and then break the top matzah, clearly then the bracha of Hamotzi was recited over the top matzah. But we're not sure. We say, 1 second, the Shita Sagainim and Ravon and Ravia is in Riva is that it's the middle matzah. So don't break the matzah yet. Because just in case, they're right. And maybe the bracha of al achilas matzah recited over the whole matzah, so don't break it yet. So therefore, we didn't break the matzah yet. And that's why the Alter Rebbe, his instructions are, after the bracha of al achilat matzah, then comes the instructions in the Seder, va'achar kach yivtza. And after you break merely means to break apart, to partake. That's when you partake of that's when you start to break it. Why va'achar kach yivtza? And he says furthermore, achar kach yivtza kezayit mikol achad. You take a kezayit, which is like an ounce, from each of the matzot, and after you break off a kezayit from each of the matzot, the next thing is going to be then you eat them together. And this is a very important key. But first, let's talk about this business of breaking. You're breaking the top matzah and the bottom matzah and the middle matzah together at the same time. You're breaking a kezayit off each one. Now, by the way, it happens to be that most of the time, once you're finished breaking the middle matzah, what's left behind is barely a kezayit anyway. But if you would have more than a kezayit, you had very thick matzah, and matzah once upon a time used to be much thicker than it is today. It's very thick matzah, you would have maybe more than a kezayit. So you break off a kezayit from the middle matzah. And you break off from the top matzah. Why are we breaking both matzahs? And here is the big question. For hamotzi lechem min haaretz, you don't have to tear off an ounce of challah. When you make hamotzi lechem min haaretz, even if you tear off a smidgen of challah, that still works. And you have to make a bracha of hamotzi, even if you eat a very small amount. The bracha of al natilat yadayim is another story. You have to eat a certain amount. But the bracha of hamotzi, even if you're having a small amount, a crouton, you have to make hamotzi. This is another, not a Pesach halacha, but people put croutons in their salad and they're eating croutons. You have to wash for that. Those are pieces of bread, toasted pieces of bread. You have to wash for. You don't have to wash only for a kezayit. So why do you have to break off a kezayit from the top matzah? If the top matzah is the hamotzi lechem min haaretz matzah, it's the lechem mishnah matzah, and the middle matzah is the matzah of doing the mitzvah of eating matzah. Why am I breaking a kezayit off the top matzah? Says the Rebbe, kivan sha'achilas matzah tzarech liyas b'kezayis, because the mitzvah of eating matzah requires a kezayit. Remember the story of the Klezmer Rebbe? He couldn't make a bracha on the matzah. Why not? Because he didn't have a kezayit. So you can only make a bracha if you have a kezayit of matzah. If you have less than an ounce of matzah to eat, you can't make a bracha. Okay, but the top matzah, isn't that the hamotzi lechem min haaretz matzah? I should be taking a small piece of that matzah and eating just a small piece. Incidentally, let's step aside. Let's step outside of the Seder for a minute. The next morning, you go to shul, you come home for lunch, and there's going to be how many matzot on the table? The next morning, first day of Pesach, Sudat Yom Tov. How many matzahs are going to be on the table? This is not a trick question. Two. And whoever's leading the meal is going to take the 2 matzahs and lift them up and is going to say, Hamotzi lechem min haaretz. And what's he going to do then? He's going to take that matzah, he's going to break it into little pieces and distribute it to all the family or guests at the table. He's not going to take a kazayat off. He's not going to break off a piece like this and start to stuff his face with a whole kazayat of matzah. He took off a little piece of it. So why am I now breaking a kazayat off the top matzah, which is like almost a half a matzah, depending on your thinness or thickness of the matzah? Why am I breaking a kazayat? Says the Rebbe, not because hamotzi needs a kazayat. Hamotzi doesn't need a kazayat. Alachilat matzah needs a kazayat. There's the opinion, the school of thought that says, Matzah ha'alef, that when am I fulfilling the mitzvah of alachilat matzah? From which matzah? Top one. The Yesh Omrim, then there's another opinion that says, no, the top one is the hamotzi one. That's just the lechem mishnah one. When am I fulfilling the matzah of alachilas matzah? With what? With the middle one. But when it's going to have these two competing schools of thought. So if I have two competing schools of thought, I have to take a kazayat from each one. I have to break a kazayat off each one. And that's why I couldn't break the top matzah before. Because if I would have broken the top matzah before, I wouldn't be able to make the bracha of alachilat matzah over a whole matzah. And according to the sheet of the Goinim, that's what I'm supposed to be doing. You see how we're covering this elegant, creative way of covering both schools of thought?
It's tough. It's confusing.
It's really not. I mean, it's nuanced. It's not confusing. Think about it. It makes.
To be mindful.
Yeah. Mindfulness is a big thing here. Yeah. That's it. This is about doing it right. If you don't want to know how to do it right, this is how you do it right. But you have to understand the logic. Like, nobody can say Judaism doesn't make any sense. It makes a lot of sense. It can drive you crazy, yes. You know, like as they say in Yiddish, to halten cup, you know, to keep the calculation and to collate all the different opinions and put it all together. Yes, but it's logical. There is a logic here. Obviously, it's a logic which is based on faith. It's not like a logical thing to eat matzah. We eat matzah because Hashem tells us to eat matzah. But once we have this mitzvah where we're buying into the mitzvah of eating matzah, we want to do the mitzvah right.
So there's not enough for everybody there.
Exactly. But that's the point, Chava. There's not going to be enough for everybody there. That's why everybody has to have their own matzah. But everybody doesn't have to have their own 3 matzahs. We don't have to sit around the table where everybody has a ka'ara, everybody has a Seder plate. We need a Seder plate on the table. So everybody has a matzah. What I do in my house, before we start, I make sure that everybody has a kazayat of matzah. I go over to the matzah, we have a matzah tash, have a matzah cover. Everybody gets a kazayat. And everybody has their matzah at the table. And only after everybody has the matzah, and then we go through the instructions. And we say, okay, this is what's going to happen, everybody. Listen carefully. This is how we're going to do it. And once we make our bracha, do not stop until you finish your mitzvahs. Yes, we do our own bracha for ourselves. However, when I make the bracha of hamotzi lechem min haaretz, I have in mind my wife, my daughters, and whatever guests they have at the table, unless they have their own Seder plate. Why? And that's why it's alachilat matzah. Because here we have a question of which is the right bracha to make over the matzah. And that way everybody fulfills the mitzvah of lechem mishnah and the mitzvah of eating matzah that the story was told of him. We don't put matzah on the table during the story, during the Haggadah. The matzah comes out before we wash. When everybody knows what to do, there's no talking everybody. Now we got mitzvahs to do. The matzah, everybody's matzah is not on the table when we start. You know what would happen if everybody's matzah is on the table? Some of it would get nibbled. Yeah, I know my crowd. You know, because it's gonna. So no, the matzah on the table is the ka'ara matzah, the Seder plate matzah. Right, but once you're going to go wash, before you're going to wash, you make sure that everybody has the matzah they need, and people shouldn't be chatting. Eating matzah is a serious thing. It has to be in a certain amount of time. Should definitely not take you more than 6 minutes. And you don't make interruptions. And not everybody loves matzah, even though they're probably hungry by now.
So we're not having both.
Oh. You're not having more than one kazayit. You're eating an ounce of matzah.
But you said we should have the top and the
Who should have the top and the middle? The person who has the Seder plate. That's the point. That's why I say to people, want to have a Seder plate? Oh yeah, I'll have a Seder plate. Sure, pile up my matzahs. And before you're going to have a Seder plate, let me tell you what the halacha is. You might not want to have a Seder plate. Because you have a Seder plate, you have to eat twice as much matzah. You have to eat the middle matzah and the top matzah. Aha. And that's why, so now we understand why we don't break the matzah right away, like Reb Simcha Vitri said. And now we also understand why we're not giving out little pieces of that matzah. Because if the top matzah was the hamotzi matzah, perfect, give out little pieces of it. If everybody can have to be part of the lechem mishnah by having a little piece. But if the top matzah is the achilat mitzvah matzah, you got to make sure you have a kazayit. You can't give little pieces out. You have a kazayit to eat. If you have a kazayit to eat, so then you got to focus on what you're doing. And that's why we don't break the matzah till afterwards. Because Rashi had his shita, but the Alter Rebbe is chaya. She's concerned about the shita of Rashi and Rashbam, and also as well as the shita of the Tosfos and the Ge'inim. It's only the Alter Rebbe. This is in the big Shulchan Aruch. Alter Rebbe is just very succinct about it. Now comes, before we're going to get, now let's leave aside the business of the top matzah, middle matzah. Now there's going to be a missing word here. You take the matzah, what should the next thing to do be? You take the matzah, you break the matzah. Let me back up for a second so you'll understand what I'm asking you. You cut the challah, and what's the next thing you do after you cut the challah? You cut the challah and then, you dip it in the salt, and then you eat the matzah. But the Alter Rebbe says, va'achar kach, he says, you break the matzah, kezayet echad mishtem, ve'yochlem, and you eat them. Hey, 1 second. So you look in the Shulchan Aruch. The Shulchan Aruch says, V'yikach hamatzah keseder shenichem aprusa ben shtei hashlemis. And the Shulchan Aruch says, after you put the matzah in between the two, you make a bracha of hamotzi, alachilas matzah, achar kach yivtza me'ashlema ha'elyona v'haprusa mishtehem. And the Shulchan Aruch says, v'yitabel b'melach. You dip it in salt. That's what the Shulchan Aruch of Rabbi Yosef Karo says. And v'yochlem. And then you eat it. But the Rabbeinu Moshe Isilish says, Hago, 1 second, Be'ein haminog l'tavla. We do not have the minog to dip it balayla rishona on the first night. And the Chak Yaakov says that balayla harishona is not only the first night, he means rak shnei leilot, both nights, the Seder nights. The Seder nights. Remember, Yosef Karo, where was he living? In Tzfat. How many Seders did they have in Tzfat? Exactly. Where's Reb Moshe living? In Poland. Where's the Chak Yaakov living? In Poland also. So he says, when the Beis Yosef writes the first night, and even when the Ramah writes the first night here, even though he's living in Poland, you should know that the same would apply to the second night as well. Where's our salt? Alter Rebbe doesn't say anything about dipping in salt. Why doesn't he say dip in the salt? Because the Ramah says. Why does the Ramah say that? What's the reason? So the Rebbe notes right away, V'yochlem ve'eino tovel b'melach. You don't dip it in the salt. Why not? Says the Alter Rebbe, mipnei chibuv mitzvah. Because of your feelings of love and awe and respect for the mitzvah. Because you cherish the mitzvah. And because you cherish the mitzvah, that's why you want to focus only on this mitzvah. Shelo yehei ta'aruvet tam acher klal. There should be no other taste at all. And the Rebbe says, what's the origin of this? He says Maharil. Maharil is Rabbi Yaakov Mulin, who is the forerunner of all Ashkenazic halacha, and Shulchan Aruch Rabbeinu. Why does he say the Maharil and the Shulchan Aruch Rabbeinu? Because the Maharil wrote like this. Amar Mahari Segel. The matzah of the bracha of hamotzi of shtei loilot the Pesach ein tovlin b'melach. We don't dip it in salt, kemo b'sha'ar hashana, like we do the rest of the year. Why not? Mipnei, and here he uses a different language. It says chibat mitzvah, because of the endearment of a mitzvah. Chibuv is more of a verb. It's like you are cherishing the mitzvah. Whereas here he speaks about more like an adverb, almost like a noun. Chibat mitzvah. There is a thing called cherishment of a mitzvah. Velet din tzarech b'sheish ad sheyavet melech. So we don't have the thing of business of when we don't eat the bread until the salt comes, over here it doesn't apply. Maharil does not explain himself at all. He just says, Mipnei chibat mitzvah. Now the language of the Chok Yankiv, he doesn't say chibat, he says chibuv, an act of cherishment. It's a verb. Chok Yaakov modifies. And the Alter Rebbe in Shulchan Aruch, the Alter Rebbe not only does he bring down, he says there is a custom, many people dip the matzah in salt. Which do they dip in salt? The hamotzi part. And then they dip the achilas matzah one. And because we don't know which one, you dip them both in salt. However, b'medinot elu, in these parts, which is Eastern Europe, noagin ain't noagin kain. Why? So the Alter Rebbe explains himself. He says because the halacha that requires salt is when you have bread which has a good deal of
Sugar.
No. The bread they used to make once upon a time had a lot of bran. It was not clean bread. And because it had a lot of bran, it oftentimes didn't taste that good. Why did it have bran? Why do you think it had bran? Because it could keep you alive even though it doesn't taste good. And they didn't have the luxury of throwing the bran out. So they mixed the bran into the flour and they made the bread because that way they'd be able to feed more mouths. Right? We don't know what this means today, Baruch Hashem. Now we live in an age where people die of obesity. It's the first time in history more people die of obesity than people die of starvation. But tragically, in the past, people died of starvation. Hunger was a regular occurrence once upon a time. Rahman al-Atsan. So therefore, people didn't have clean bread. They mixed who knows what into the bread. At least you can keep body and soul together. Now what happens is that it doesn't taste very good, and that's not nice for a mitzvah. So therefore, if you put a lot of salt on it, it tastes better. That's the nature of salt. It's like kids are using ketchup today. Not really, but whatever. So he says, but our bread, already in the time of the Alter Rebbe, we're going now 18th century, was pretty clean. It's pretty clean bread already. It wasn't like the bread of Middle Ages. And even though the other days of Pesach, in that case, do we dip the matzah in the salt on the other days because the matzah is pretty clean now? The answer is yes, we do. We do dip it in salt, even though it's clean. So he says, nonetheless, bebeis leilot elo, on these 2 nights, meaning the Seder nights, the Alter Rebbe is leaning heavily on the Chok Yaakov here, ein noagim kain, and here he adds the words, mipnei, because of chibuv mitzvah. And the Alter Rebbe explains himself. The Maharil does not explain himself. Even the Chok Yaakov doesn't really explain himself. The Alter Rebbe adds words here, original words here, in which the Alter Rebbe explains the halacha. Latzeit yedei chovato b'matzah she'ein ima tarovet tam acher. What does it mean to love a mitzvah? If I love a mitzvah, I should put salt on it. I should make it more delicious. Why is that showing that you cherish the mitzvah? Why is not having salt an act of endearment for a mitzvah? Why is that an act of cherish and respect a mitzvah? Why? Because if I love you along with something else, I don't love you so much. But if I love you, unadorned, just as you are. If I love the matzah, I love the matzah as is. And therefore, I don't want to mix anything else into the matzah. That's why we starve ourselves Erev Pesach, right? Because the only way for matzah to actually taste good is for you to be very hungry. And by the time that way you're so hungry that it smells good, matzah. Anything almost will taste good at this point. Huh? It's beautiful. It's Shabbat this year. You have a whole afternoon to hunger yourself. What's the problem? And to study Torah, and take a nap, and all kinds of exciting things, but you're not supposed to speak about that. Not the nap part, anyway. Just do it. So the point here is that this is the understanding of why there's no salt. Now, I just want to point out to you that the business of which bracha we're making over which matzah, that's part of showing your love for the mitzvah also. I love the mitzvah, so I want to do it in the perfect way. I want to follow every possibility. I want to do it in the most amazing, most exquisite fashion. That's all about showing love for a mitzvah. Because this is important. And I want to do it right, to the best of my ability. So it's all really part of this. It's not mutually exclusive, but it goes together. And the Rebbe adds here that you should know that this was also the practice of the Rebbes. Chenu minig beis harav. And that is surprising. Why is that surprising? The Rebbe says in the parentheses, "V'tzarich this has to be like better understood." It's a little surprising, because the Shelah writes, and this is not in the regular Shnei Luchot Habrit. Michael David saying you can't fast on Shabbos. I didn't say fast. You could eat some bananas. I didn't say you don't stuff yourself. The Shelah says, and this is found not in the regular Shnei Luchot Habrit, but in a Seder called Shar HaShamayim. Sidur Shar HaShamayim was first printed in the year 1866. There's a Siddur that came out with teachings of the Shelah. And in the Siddur Shar HaShamayim, the Shelah quotes the Arizal as a tradition from the Arizal that we should always have salt. That it's very important to have salt. Salt is a big deal. Always have to have salt. So the Rebbe says very surprising, because we follow the mystical tradition. And here it's a halakhic thing. But what about the mystical tradition? So the Rebbe says surprising. But the Rebbe says, Ulaheir, I would point out to you what the Alter Rebbe says in the Dibur HaMaschil of Lo Tashbis in Sifches, which is in Likutei Torah. So before I go to Likutei Torah, what the Rebbe says, I just want to tell you something very interesting. There's a short mimer from the Rebbe. There's a book of Maimarim called Maimarim HaKetzorim, the short Maimarim of the Alter Rebbe. And over there in the Maimarim HaKetzorim, this is on page Tafkuf, page 500, it says that the Arizal said it's very, very important to make sure you have bread and salt on the table. You have to have salt. But then the Arizal says, the Alter Rebbe says, but in today's day and age where there's salt mixed into the dough, so the salt mixed into the dough serves that purpose. It already has salt. All bread today has salt. Everything has salt. Except for one thing that doesn't have salt. Matzah. Matzah has flour and water, and that's the problem. So 1 second. So a taka doesn't have salt. And the Arizal says you always have to have salt. And the Alter Rebbe's reasoning of why you don't have salt on the table always is because the bread has salt in it anyway. But this bread doesn't have salt. Uh-oh. So here in this mimer, and like we're a little bit short on time already, it's a fascinating mimer called Lisashbis Melech, where he speaks about the importance of salt. Why is salt so important? Why is it such a big deal? Why should we always have salt? And essentially, the idea of salt is seen quite literally as a preservative. But salt represents humility. And people sometimes get carried away with themselves. And the salt represents that humbling factor. And that humbling factor enables a person to maintain his or her humility so that they don't get carried away with success, with achievement, including spiritual success and achievement. Salt of the earth, exactly, very good, Bill. And what this means in Torah study is the mystical, spiritual part of Torah keeps you humble. Sometimes a person is so successful at the technical part of Torah that it starts to get to his head. So the mystical part of Torah, the spiritual teachings of Torah humble you. That's like salt. But the Alter Rebbe cites a Tikkunei Zohar, which is found in a very long tikkun. I started looking for it, I couldn't find it. It's somewhere in there. It's in Tikkun Samach Tes, which is in one of the codicils of the Zohar. There's 70 entries, but the last two are very long. Samach Tes 9 are very long. Somewhere in that Tikkun Zohar, it's brought down that the meaning of lechem oni is humble bread. Poor as in humble, because poor people are generally not so arrogant. And the poor bread is the bread that inherently makes you humble. And he says that that's how we start our journey. You have to start your journey off with maximum level of humility. And the journey of self-refinement and of self-engineering for the first week of the Sfirat HaOmer starts off with matzah. And matzah is the poor man's bread. And because it's poor, it doesn't really need the salt. The salt is a preservative that injects humility. But the matzah, to begin with, is humble. And because the matzah, to begin with, is humble, it doesn't need salt. That's what the Alter Rebbe says. So he says that according to what we just said, the importance of salt, madua yeh shebematzah lo melech, then why doesn't matzah have salt in it? And I'm not sure if the Alter Rebbe's question is, why don't you dip the matzah in the salt? Or why don't we add matzah to the mixture? Why don't we add salt? Why don't we have flour, salt, and water? So the thing is, he says that in the Tikkunei Zohar and Tikkun Samach Tes, which, as I said, is a very long one, Here's the page number. Okay, I could have found it. But at any rate, he says that there is lechem oni beloy milcha. Over there, the Tikkun Azor says it's impoverished bread, it's humble bread, it doesn't need the salt. Sans salt. Begin the iu matzah prusa because it's just a broken piece. So therefore, because it's a broken piece, it's tzarich lekarva ala melach. You don't have to place upon it. You don't have to bring it into salt. Because it already has that humility. It's already broken. It already has an in of dalos. Dalos means impoverishment. It's already impoverished. And therefore, it doesn't need salt. Even though he explained all this business of salt, he says, this is the bread that doesn't need salt. And he said, that's why the matzah represents the idea of emunah, of simple faith. And simple faith is artless. And simple faith, emunah itself, that's what matzah represents. And the matzah itself doesn't need to be engineered. Simple faith doesn't need to be engineered in and of itself. It has that humility in a natural way. And only after a person eats the matzah for the first week, then he comes to a das, to a knowledge. That's the hasagas pnimis hatera. Like it says, Kol ha'mekayim es haTorah me'oni, sofa l'kayim me'osher. If you fulfill the Torah out of impoverishment, which means great humility and deprivation, then in the end you fulfill the Torah out of plenty or plenitude. And therefore the Alter Rebbe says, so with regard to matzah, which is the beginning of the Avodah, represents the idea, the concept of the proverbial idea of iskafia, of restraint, and person crushing his Yetzer Hara. And that's the Reishis Avodah. And that's why we don't need the salt. So basically, the Rebbe said, if you look in this, if you read over this Ma'amar L'Kutei Torah, you'll see that it's not such a big question. But the question remains, because the Shalah does say, the Shalah knew all this, and the Shalah says you do need to have salt. Now, Yitzi's pointing out that salt on the table doesn't mean to eat the salt, maybe. No, but the Shalah, in fact, says you should dip the matzah in salt. So, it's nicht as a pashat. And that's, the Rebbe says, Tzarich. It is surprising that the Rabbeim wouldn't, but the Rebbe says that's the practice of the Rabbeim. Okay, so now, back to the eating. So we're not going to dip it in salt, and we're showing how the matzah itself, we're so excited about eating it, and we have to eat, we said we have to break off 2 kezetim, 2 ounces. An ounce on the top matzah and an ounce from the middle matzah. V'yoichlem beyachad. Beyachad means together. At once. What does it mean to eat it at once? How do you eat 2 matzahs or 2 ounces of matzah at once? Says the Rebbe, the Hainu, that means sheyukonsem lepiv bevasachas, that you place both ounces of matzah into your mouth at the same time. Why? You know what you're going to look like when you place 2 ounces of matzah? Like a chipmunk. You're going to have full cheeks of matzah. Why would you do that? So the Rebbe says very simple. And this is not a chiddush of the Rebbe. This is clear in the Neisikilim and the Shulchan Aruch, and the Alter Rebbe spells it out clearly in the Shulchan Aruch. Hatam shalei hefsek bein bracha da'achilas matzah la'achilas ha'kezayet ha'shayach lo. Once you made a bracha of alachilat matzah, you have to eat a kezayet. Yes, but if I'm going to eat the kezayit of the top matzah, and my bracha of alachilat matzah was on the middle matzah, then I made an interruption. Fine, so eat the middle matzah first. But what about the opinion that the top matzah was the alachilat matzah? You understand? So I'm stuck. Either way, there's a possibility, if I eat the top matzah, then it means I made an interruption between the bracha and eating the middle matzah, because maybe it was on the middle matzah. If I eat the middle matzah, I may have made an interruption between eating the top matzah. What's the solution? The solution is jam them both into your mouth at the same time. And that way there's going to be no interruption. Huh? Well, you don't just take matzah and put it. You chew it and 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 chew it.
Well, why can't you chew and swallow and chew and swallow?
Because if you chew and swallow, then you're not filling any opinion. Then you're eating a little bit of the top and a little bit of the bottom, and you didn't eat a kezayit from the right matzah. So the only way to eat a kezayit of the right matzah is to have the whole matzah in your mouth at that time. I didn't say you have to do it. I warn people when they come to my Seder. It's going to look very funny, and that's it. Get over it. Don't look at me. Look at your matzah. You'll be fine. The Rebbe says you put it both in your mouth at the same time, right? Because we want to make sure which matzah is we're not sure eating now. Now, something very interesting. In Alter Rebbe's Shulchan Aruch, it says you put both ounces of matzah in your mouth at the same time, and then the Alter Rebbe says you don't have to swallow 2 ounces at the same time. He says, you don't have to swallow 2. What you do is you have to chew them up at the same time, and then you swallow 1 ounce at a time. Swallow 1 ounce, and then swallow another ounce. Now in the Haggadah, the Rebbe doesn't say that. And not only the Rebbe doesn't say it, the Alter Rebbe doesn't say it. The Rebbe explains that the meaning of the word v'yechlim is shiachnisam lefiv. Now Rabbi Ber Levin, the Rebbe's librarian, who put together like sources, filled in the sources of the Haggadah, he notes that the Alter Rebbe doesn't mention this in the instructions. So I called him today, and I said, does that mean that the Alter Rebbe doesn't hold you have to swallow it? In the Shulchan Aruch, he wrote one thing, but then when he wrote the Seder, he wrote you have to swallow it. He said, I don't know. Well, I said, well, you wrote something here. He says, yes, I did, but I don't know. I don't know. We don't know for sure what the Alter Rebbe says. So I said, what's your thought? So he said to me that his personal opinion is that they used to make softer matzah, and then at a certain point, everybody started making the harder matzah. And you see, he estimates there's about 30 years difference between the Alter Rebbe's writing of the Shulchan Aruch and the writing of the Seder, the instruction of the Seder. And he says in those 30 years, a lot changed in Eastern Europe, and they went from the soft matzah to the hard matzah. And he says, I don't believe it's possible to swallow 1 ounce of hard matzah these days. So that's his opinion. But now, he may be right and he may be wrong. I don't know. What I did find very interesting is there's Rabbi Yeshua Munshain, Olav Shalom, put together an oitzer in Haggai Chabad. Yeah, that's Munshain. That's my Mechut. My grandson's named after him. So he says, he writes over there that by the Rebbe's Seder, they could see the Rebbe putting the matzah in his mouth at the same time. And the Rebbe, by the way, didn't have any teeth. The Rebbe worked very, very hard, breaking into little pieces to put the whole matzah in his mouth. But it was clear that the Rebbe was not swallowing in 2 gulps the whole matzah. So I have a feeling that, with all respect to Rabbi Levin of soft matzah and hard matzah, I have a feeling that what the Alter Rebbe wrote in the Shulchan Aruch, he wrote in the Shulchan Aruch, and in the Seder, he befedish did not write that. So the bottom line is, if he didn't write it, you don't have to try to do it. You don't have to swallow a kazayit at a time. As long as you get it into your mouth, that's sufficient. So you chew up the matzah quickly, you fill your mouth, so to speak, and after you filled your mouth with matzah, then you swallow the matzah. And that's the mitzvah. That's the right way to do this mitzvah. And that's why I call tonight's class, What We Eat. Run the by you again? Yeah. Be mindful of all the things we talked about, the 2 different schools of thought. When you make hamotzi, you don't have to eat an ounce. You can eat just a little bit. But when you make alachilat matzah, you have to eat an ounce. You may have recited that bracha over the top matzah. That's where the kazayit comes from. You may have recited the bracha over the middle matzah. Once you make a bracha over a mitzvah, you have to follow through with the action. So if you made a bracha ala chilat matzah on the middle matzah, and then you ate the top matzah first, that's an interruption. You did a hamotzi mitzvah before you did a chilas matzah. So they said, well, fine, then just eat the middle matzah. Well, not so fast. Another school of thought said that the top matzah, the whole matzah was the ala chilat matzah one. Then which one are you going to eat? And the answer is both. But because you don't want to make an interruption, you get both into your mouth at the same time. Which makes for a strange optics. But that's what we eat. So before people want a Seder plate, you might tell them, and they might not be so sure. Now, what happens if a person says, I'm not doing that, that's crazy, I can't do that? Which a lot of people, by the way, say, I'm not. So in that case, it says clearly in Shulchan Aruch, then eat the kazayit of the top matzah. I think, one second. I don't want to speak out of turn. Iker Kesvara Rishena, the Birchas HaMoitzi is on the top matzah. Lefikach, you have to, if you can only do one. So if my memory doesn't fail me right now, I'm not seeing it right over here. B'di'eved, and even if you ate one after the other, so b'di'eved, you still fulfill the mitzvah. There's not even a question, you still fulfill the mitzvah. But l'chatchila, if you only plan, huh? The Alter Rebbe says, "Oichel betchila hakazayis me'ashlema." That if you want to eat one, you eat the kazayit from the top matzah. But afterwards, even if you're not going to eat them together, you still have to eat both matzahs. That's for sure. So if you can't put it in your mouth together, you eat the top matzah first, and then you eat the middle matzah. But if you want to have a Seder plate, you do have to eat both matzahs. So you have to end up eating twice as much. You get a double portion. If you want to do this right. And all of this goes back to cherishing a mitzvah and the opportunity for a mitzvah and seeking to do the mitzvah to the best of our ability. And that, my dear friends, concludes the section on Matzah. Bezrat Hashem, in our next episode, which I think is going to happen in a year from now, or next year Pesach, we'll move from Matzah into Maror. Huh? Maror, we'll get this. Lots about the Maror. You don't have to eat a double portion of Maror. Okay, Shikoyach. The Eibishter should help us that this year we should not only be eating lots of matzah, but we should be eating Korban Pesach, because Mashiach will have brought us home, Mirz Hashem. May that be B'mhedo, B'in Amen. Thank you very much for joining online. Please share, please subscribe. You know what to do. And hopefully, as I said, all these things will apply a whole lot more as we're going to have not only the matzah, but also the steak and the korban. Laila Tov. Gute Nacht.